The Nile didn't just give life to Egypt, it gave birth to Cleopatra. She wasn't born in a palace, she was born in a furnace. The year was 69 BCE. Egypt, once the jewel of the ancient world, was cracked and bleeding. Rome's long arm was already coiled around its neck, and the Ptolemaic dynasty, the Greek rulers who'd inherited Alexander's empire, had become little more than puppets. Gold bought silence, bribes kept the crown, and betrayal was the family sport. Cleopatra VII, Theophilopater, was the third child of Ptolemy XII, also known as Auletes, the flute player. A weak man obsessed with art and excess, he lacked the iron to hold his kingdom together. He lavished money on Roman senators to keep his title, emptying Egypt's coffers while letting famine and unrest rot the nation from within. The people hated him. His own court mocked him behind silk curtains. Cleopatra saw all of it. Even as a young girl, she noticed how her father flinched around Roman envoys, how he spent more time polishing his image in Rome than governing in Alexandria. She noticed who bowed lowest and who didn't bow at all. She learned early that appearances meant survival, but truth meant power. In the Ptolemaic court, there were no fairy tales. Cleopatra's family was filled with backstabbers and poisoners. Siblings plotted against each other. Mothers murdered sons. Fathers married daughters to brothers, then fed them to jackals in the desert. Cleopatra's bloodline was Macedonian, not Egyptian, and their palace was a pressure cooker of ego, envy, and fear. Unlike her brothers and sisters, Cleopatra wasn't raised to be ornamental. She didn't wait for power to be handed to her. She prepared to take it. She studied language not just as a courtly skill, but as a weapon. She became fluent in Greek, Egyptian, Aramaic, Latin, Hebrew, and possibly Ethiopian. She wasn't just showing off. She was building bridges for alliances, leverage, and survival. No other Ptolemaic ruler had ever learned Egyptian. They saw themselves as superior. Cleopatra did the opposite. She knew that to own Egypt, she had to belong to it. She read Egyptian law, visited temples, spoke with priests. While her siblings played in perfumed gardens, Cleopatra walked through the markets. She watched how the people suffered, how food disappeared, how soldiers grew angry. She understood power wasn't in the throne, it was in the streets. When she was around 10, her father was overthrown. A mob driven by starvation and disgust forced him out of Alexandria. Cleopatra was thrown into the whirlwind. Her sisters took sides. Riots exploded in the capital. But even then, she didn't flinch. Ptolemy XII fled to Rome to beg for help. Cleopatra watched from afar as her father humbled himself before the Roman Senate, offering Egypt's treasures in exchange for a military escort back to the throne. He got his wish. In 55 BCE, Roman legions marched into Egypt, crushed the resistance, and reinstated Ptolemy XII. Cleopatra returned with him, and she returned watching everything. She saw what it cost. The blood of her people paid for her father's weakness. Cleopatra didn't blame Rome for that. She blamed her father. When he died in 51 BCE, he left the crown to Cleopatra and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII. She was 18. He was 10. But Egypt didn't care about age. Egypt wanted strength. And so did the snakes in the palace. Cleopatra knew immediately that she wasn't truly co-ruler. Her brother's guardians, especially the ruthless regent Pothinus and the general Achilles, aimed to control Egypt through the boy. Cleopatra was meant to be the ceremonial front, the pretty face, the figurehead. But Cleopatra had teeth. Within months, she started pushing back, issuing orders in her name alone, minting coins without her brother's face. She even removed her brother's name from official documents. She wasn't going to share power. She was going to seize it. The backlash came fast. Her enemies, threatened by her ambition, struck back. They turned the Alexandrian court against her, portraying her as arrogant, dangerous, and too Roman in her politics. By 49 BCE, Cleopatra had been forced out of the capital. She fled to the eastern desert with a few loyalists, surviving in exile while plotting her return. It could have ended there. She could have vanished into the sands like so many royal exiles before her. But Cleopatra didn't just want her throne back. She wanted control of the game board. And she was about to meet a man who played at the highest level. Rome was in civil war. Julius Caesar, fresh off defeating his rival Pompey, had landed in Egypt chasing his enemy's shadow. Ptolemy XIII thought he could impress Caesar with a gift. He presented Pompey's severed head. It backfired. Caesar was appalled. Cleopatra saw her opening. Smuggled into Caesar's palace, rolled in a rug, or perhaps hidden in a sack of laundry, depending on the version, Cleopatra appeared before Caesar not as a supplicant, but as an equal. She didn't plead, she persuaded. She painted a vision of Egypt that served both of them. She didn't offer herself, she offered empire. That moment wasn't seduction, it was strategy. Cleopatra understood Caesar's ambition. She gave him a chance to remake Egypt in his image, through her. In return, she'd get her throne and make herself untouchable. She wasn't just the last daughter of a crumbling dynasty anymore. She was becoming something far more dangerous, a queen who knew how to survive in a world where men like Caesar ruled. And she was just getting started. When Cleopatra returned to Alexandria in 48 BCE, she wasn't walking into a royal court. She was walking into a war zone. Her brother Ptolemy XIII had been declared sole ruler during her exile. His advisors, Pothinus, the corrupt regent, and the general Achilles, held the real power and had turned the palace into a den of vipers. Cleopatra wasn't just an exiled co-ruler anymore, she was a threat. The moment she returned, she risked assassination. But Cleopatra had Caesar now, and Caesar didn't do favors, he made investments. Rome was in chaos. Julius Caesar had crossed the Rubicon, defeated Pompey, and chased him all the way to Egypt. What he found disgusted him, Pompey's severed head, presented by Ptolemy XIII's court as a trophy. Cleopatra saw Caesar's anger and used it. She presented herself not as a seductress, but as a stabilizer. Egypt needed her, and Caesar needed Egypt. The legend of her arriving rolled in a rug may be dramatic, but it gets one thing right. Cleopatra was willing to take monumental risks for power. No guards, no army, just wit, audacity, and the ability to read men like books. Caesar agreed to arbitrate between Cleopatra and her brother. It was political theater, but the conclusion was foregone. He backed her claim. Ptolemy XIII and his supporters refused to accept the ruling. They launched a siege on Alexandria, cutting off Caesar and Cleopatra inside the palace. What followed was the Alexandrian War, a brutal street-by-street battle for control of the city. The fighting was fierce. The famous Library of Alexandria burned during the chaos. Cleopatra stood beside Caesar as Roman and Egyptian troops clashed. Her allegiance wasn't just symbolic. She provided ships, supplies, and information. She gambled everything on Caesar, and it paid off. Reinforcements from Rome arrived. Caesar's forces crushed Ptolemy's army. The boy king tried to flee across the Nile in a boat. He drowned, dragged under by his own gilded armor. Cleopatra was now undisputed ruler, but she knew better than to reign alone. She married her even younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, who was only 12, to preserve tradition. But he was a figurehead. Cleopatra wielded the real power. She also gave birth to Caesar's son. Ptolemy XV Philopator Caesar, known as Caesarion, Little Caesar. His birth was a declaration of dynasty. Not only had Cleopatra regained the throne, she had given it Roman legitimacy through blood. In Egypt, she was hailed as Isis reborn. Statues and coins depicted her as a living goddess. Her rule was absolute, and for the first time in years, Egypt had a monarch who acted like a ruler, not a puppet. But not everyone celebrated. In Rome, the news of Caesar's alliance with Cleopatra caused a ripple of unease. He already had a wife, Calpurnia. Cleopatra had traveled to Rome in 46 BCE with Caesarion and lived in Caesar's villa just outside the city. Her presence caused scandal. She was a foreign queen with too much influence over the dictator. When Caesar declared himself dictator for life, many saw Cleopatra's influence behind the throne. Whispers of monarchy, of Eastern-style dynasties, stirred resentment among Roman elites. Cleopatra's power wasn't just political, it was existential. To them, she represented a dangerous shift away from the Republic. On the Ides of March 44 BCE, Caesar was assassinated by senators who called themselves the Liberators. They stabbed him 23 times on the Senate floor. Cleopatra's world collapsed. She fled Rome immediately, taking Caesarion back to Alexandria. She had gambled everything on Caesar, and now he was gone. Worse, she had no standing in Rome. Caesar hadn't named Caesarion his heir. That title went to Octavian, Caesar's 18-year-old great-nephew and adopted son. But Cleopatra didn't fold. She regrouped. Egypt remained hers. Caesarion remained her card, and she watched Rome once again tear itself apart in civil war, waiting for her next move. It came in the form of Mark Antony. After Caesar's death, Rome was divided between three men: Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus. Together they formed the Second Triumvirate, vowing to crush Caesar's assassins and restore order. Antony took control of the eastern provinces and summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus in 41 BCE to answer questions about her loyalty. Cleopatra didn't just respond, she made an entrance. She arrived in a barge draped in purple sails, dressed as the goddess Aphrodite. Perfume lingered in the air, servants fanned her, musicians played. Antony was captivated before she even spoke. But this wasn't seduction for pleasure, it was power play. Cleopatra needed a new Roman protector. Antony needed Egypt's wealth to fund his ambitions. Their affair became political almost immediately. Cleopatra invited him to Alexandria, and he stayed for months. They drank, hunted, partied, but also schemed. She became his partner in both indulgence and ambition. She bore him twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and later another son, Ptolemy Philadelphus. A new dynasty seemed to be forming, one that combined Roman might with Egyptian majesty. But it was fragile. Octavian, now rising as Rome's strongest man, portrayed Cleopatra as a threat to Roman values. He accused her of bewitching Antony, of corrupting him with Eastern decadence. He spread rumors that Antony planned to abandon Rome and rule from Alexandria, with Cleopatra as his queen. The propaganda worked. When Antony declared Caesarion as the rightful heir of Caesar and distributed eastern territories among his and Cleopatra's children in the donations of Alexandria, it was the final insult. Rome erupted. Octavian used this to justify war. In 32 BCE, the Roman Senate declared war, not on Antony, but on Cleopatra. She was framed as the real enemy, the foreign queen, the serpent in the heart of the empire. Cleopatra didn't back down. She raised a fleet, poured Egypt's treasury into the war effort. She and Antony sailed together to meet Octavian at Actium in 31 BCE. The battle was a disaster. Cleopatra, seeing the tide turning, made a strategic retreat with her ships. Antony followed. The remaining fleet was decimated. It was a catastrophic loss. The world now knew Octavian had won. Antony was finished, but Cleopatra still had Egypt, still had Caesarion, and still had one last plan left to play. To be continued. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more interesting content.